Hi, I'm Dr. MASSOLIT. I'm an Associate Professor of Sport and Exercise Psychology at Staffordshire University in the UK. In this course, we're going to be focusing on audience effects, and there's going to be 4 lectures where we cover this really interesting topic. We're going to begin with a focus on looking at how an audience and the presence of others impacts on performance. In the second lecture, we'll focus in particular on the impact of home advantage or home disadvantage. In the third lecture, we'll focus on a particular study by Robert Zajonc and colleagues from 1969. And then the final lecture will focus on strategies that can be employed to improve performance of athletes in the presence of others. In other words, when there are audiences around. So in this first lecture, we'd like to focus on the idea that having an audience may have an impact on how we perform in our sport. So if we think back to the very first study of sports psychology by Triplett, what he was interested in was following up a hunch he'd had. When he was out and about, he thought that he observed cyclists when they were cycling in pairs or in groups, they would perform better, ride faster and farther, compared to when they were cycling on their own. So he had this idea that perhaps when we're with other people, whether it's one other person or it's a broader group, perhaps we'd perform better. And he tested this in what's known as the first study of sports psychology. Indeed, Norman Triplett's known as the founding father, if you like, of sports psychology because of this experiment. And in this experiment, he pitted cyclists up against either themselves competing on their own, or they were doing it in the presence of others. There were other people around. And what he found backed up his hunch. It supported his hypotheses that when other people were around, there was an audience, there was a presence of other people, then the cyclists performed better. This became known as social facilitation. The idea here is that when we're performing, if there are other people around, then we're going to perform better on that particular task. So in cycling, for example, it might be that we ride further or ride faster. We think about athletics, 400 meters, for instance, going into a race and being on that racetrack completely on your own with nobody around versus going on to the racetrack to do 400 meters when you've got competitors against you and you've also got a crowd supporting you and shouting and screaming. Think about yourself perhaps in that situation and what would bring out a better performance, more effort for you in that particular situation. Well, social facilitation would indicate that when you're in the presence of others, so there's competitors around and there's the audience around, then you're more likely to perform better, do a quicker time, perhaps in the 400 meters. So to build on this initial work, Robert Zajonc proposed and applied the drive theory. And what was suggested here was that the presence of others, of the audience, led to an increase in arousal, and it was that increase in arousal that led to better performance. And it was suggested that this would be a positive and linear relationship. In other words, the greater the increase in arousal because of the audience, the greater the increase in performance. Relatively simplistic theory in terms of when it was proposed, and indeed it has been critiqued and discussed quite widely in the literature since, but this was the early kind of conception of it in the sense that, okay, there's an audience here. I feel more motivated, more aroused because people are watching me and more likely to be judged. I want to do better. And those factors combined perhaps improved my performance when I completed a particular task. Now, thinking moved on a little bit, and Zajonc thought a little bit more about this kind of idea. Maybe it's not quite as simple as the fact that when there's an audience, we get an increased arousal and we get increased performance. Perhaps it's a little bit more complicated. And in an update of that kind of model, Zajonc suggested that perhaps the audience produces the dominant response, which is not always a better performance response. So in other words, when there is an audience or presence of others in a particular situation, we get a spike in arousal. And then it depends whether the athlete sees the task as easy or maybe they're an expert in that task. If they do, perhaps that's when they get an improvement in performance and they perform well. On the other hand, the next athlete, they get the spike in arousal as well because of the audience, but they may perceive the task to be difficult, or perhaps they're a novice, they've not really done the task before. And according to Zajonc, that's where perhaps there could be a performance decrement, so their performance actually decreases. So you get this kind of splitting effect that you might have a particular level that an athlete performs at when they're on their own. When there is an audience, if they're an expert, if they feel the task is fairly easy, they can do it, their performance will improve beyond that average level, if you like. But on the flip side, if the athlete feels like the task is difficult, they don't really have confidence in completing the task, perhaps they're a novice, they're doing it for one of the first times, they're trying to learn a skill, for example, the performance will decrease. And this is quite interesting, and perhaps you can think about trying to learn a new skill for a moment and think about that as quite a nice example of this dominant response hypothesis. If you're learning to juggle, and you never juggled before, for example, most people would generally prefer to be, shown what to do and maybe have a coach, but they'd like to try it either one-to-one with a coach or on their own, rather than a room full of people watching them trying to learn that skill. And this kind of feeds into Zajonc's idea, really, that if you think that task is quite difficult, or if you're a novice, you've not done it before, you're trying to learn something for the first time, it's likely your performance will decrease when there's presence of an audience and people are watching you, perhaps because of evaluation and judgment of other people watching you do that. So in terms of audience effects, it's interesting from a social psychological perspective because it's suggested that an audience really does have an impact on how people perform. It's interesting as well thinking about the lockdown period we've been through because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll come on to cover that in a later lecture in a little bit more detail, but that's giving us a great example, an experiment, a real life experiment, I guess, if you like, of how we see performance change when full stadiums compare to empty stadiums, because they have to. And it's interesting as well when we're thinking about, perhaps as a coach or a sports psychologist, how we can help our athletes to learn new skills and perform as well as possible based upon these findings. So if we're working with our team and we're trying to teach them a new tactic, for example, a new play or a new skill, then the presence of an audience, according to Zajonc's theory, wouldn't be particularly helpful for their performance while they're learning the skill. But over time, once they get used to that tactic, they understand the play, they understand the moves that they need to do, and it becomes easier to them, then actually having an audience might actually improve their performance. So there's some interesting aspects to consider there. There's also some confounds, of course, within this. We have to think about the personality and the coping skills of the individuals. Some athletes really love performing in front of an audience, irrespective of the task. Other athletes really hate it and don't like performing in front of an audience, irrespective of the task. So there's always individual differences to be thinking about as well within this context. So in this lecture, we focused on audience effects, and in particular, focused on how an audience may help or hinder our performance. And in the next lecture, we're going to focus on home advantage or home disadvantage.